Amanda. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on logic models this morning, logic models, roadmaps to success. So just a few logistics. I am not able to see the chat screen, so Amanda will be monitoring the chat screen, and I'll be asking her to read your comments and your questions as we go through. The great thing about a webinar is you can do it from your desk. The downside of a webinar is we don't have the ability to interact face to face, and that's what makes learning really so rich and powerful. So we'll do our best to try to incorporate conversation, questions, and comments as we go through. What we're going to cover in the next hour and a half is we're going to take a look at what a logic model is, understanding that logic modeling is really complex, but just sort of breaking it down to what the basics are. Why do a logic model? We're going to walk through how to create a logic model. And I'm going to start with just the real basics and then move into looking at some logic models that have all the key elements, but also have some additional components to it as well. We'll spend just a little bit of time talking about how logic models have data embedded in them, or they are founded in data. And then we'll take a look at a couple of samples and resources, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that is the roadmap that we'll be following today. And so without further ado, we're going to jump in. So really, a logic model is just a path. And for those of you who are at our sustainability training about a month ago, we talked about this. We talked about a logic model is a map, but it's not a map that's sort of in isolation. It's in the context of the vision and mission of your organization. And so we can't just jump right into talking about logic models. One of the things that we talked about when we were doing sustainability training is the foundation of not only sustainability training, but everything that you do and everything you mobilize your board, your volunteers, and the community to do is rooted in the fact that everyone has to understand and have a shared vision of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So it's really important that your organization has a vision, your finish line, that's your destination. Your mission is how you want to get there, and the logic model is the map. So if you're an organization that wants to promote positive youth development, your mission may be that you're going to promote positive youth development by offering youth programming in after school contexts. The logic model then would outline how you would implement those after school programs. So as you can see, the logic model is integrated into the vision and mission of your work. A logic model does a number of really key things. You know, some of the organizations I work with are really busy doing the work and don't really have a logic model. They may have an action plan. Logic modeling feels like it's a lot of work or it's complicated, but really a logic model is so incredibly important to keeping your work on track. But not only that, being able to articulate your work to the community. A really well done logic model is going to present a picture of how your initiative is supposed to work. It explains why your work is a good solution to the problem. Remember that we're not the only agencies and organizations that are working on programs or problems in the community. So a logic model illustrates why us. Why us? Why fund us? Why support us? Why volunteer with us? Because we have a real clear roadmap of what it is that we're going to do. It also states the activities that will bring about change. So that's going to be rooted in your data or your evidence or your research. And in some logic modeling language, it's called a theory of change. It also keeps people moving in the same direction. It's so easy to get caught up in organizations and doing busy work and doing activities that come up as they come along. But really, a logic model keeps you on track and keeps everybody sort of understanding what the ultimate roadmap is, what the ultimate end game is, and helps everyone move in that same direction. And and this is a really important one too. It energizes support by precisely articulating what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how. When we talk about sustainability training, or we talk about organizations that require volunteers or coalition members that need people mobilized in the work, one of the things I hear over and over and over again is it's the same two or three people doing all the work. Well, a really well done logic model can help energize support by getting people to really understand what it is that you're trying to do and what the end result will be. So, a logic model is more than just a chart on a piece of paper. A logic model is really one of those tools that your agency really should use as its foundation for planning, for implementation, for evaluation, for recruitment, for more. I love this. I'm sure you all recognize this from Back to the Future. A logic model predicts the future. By understanding the context and the knowledge about cause and effect, we can construct a logical theory of change. Now, that sounds like some pretty crazy jargon, but by understanding what's happening in our community, by understanding the research, by understanding that we know if we do this, that this will be the end result, then we can say that our program or our initiative is going to result in this change. And that's a theory of change. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask Amanda to read in the chat box. Why is this important for the work that you do? Why is it important that you would be able to predict the future?
Thanks, Dorothy. This is Amanda. And while everyone is writing in their answers, we had a question pop up and it says, will we receive copies of the slides?
Oh, yes. The answer to that is yes. I've already sent it to Amanda. So the slides are already in her care.
Yep, and we'll get those out to you after the webinar and after I get the recording uploaded and things like that. So within, hopefully by mid next week, you'll all get those. So the first answer came in through Shannon, and she said, why is this important in the work you do? And she said, so that you can better align resources and efforts in future planning.
Absolutely.
And, oh, sorry, that was Alice. Shannon said, so that we can know drug trends are becoming, so we know what drug trends are becoming popular.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. So we're looking at being able to, be able to see what's coming down the road that we may need to, we'll be coming back to that when we'll be able to see what drug trends are coming down the future when we talk about logic model and adapting our logic model, but then also understanding what resources that we're going to need based on whatever's going to change in the future. So this is really helpful for us when we're thinking about sustainability, because we're also thinking about what resources we're going to solve the problem and how we're going to be able to create that change. Amanda, were there any other responses or comments?
Yes. Karen said to keep focused on our mission and not to get distracted chasing funding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is so important. The logic model is going to show exactly what it is that we need to do. Resources, not just to bring in resources or harvest dollars to get us distracted, but we'll be able to show that if we do these actual interventions, we are actually going to see an impact based on our work. And so I wanted to park here for a minute, because a lot of times what you're going to see is in a logic model is that a logic model models both at the community level, so we're talking about drug trends, that would be looking at potentially community level logic models, and we're also looking at program level logic models, but both of them are going to be embedded in a theory of change. And I wanted to just keep us sort of grounded in that piece. I'm not going to get too deep into the jargon today because I want to keep it basic, but it's really important for us to know that a logic model is a way of articulating that we know what the problem is and what needs to be done and what the outcome is. So if a logic model is a roadmap, what do you do if your road looks like this? So we may know where we want to get there, where we want to go, but if it's a traffic jam, it may take us forever and a day to get there. And so I think about when I used to live in Minneapolis, and I worked in St. Paul and I lived in Minneapolis. So I had to travel the full range of the Twin Cities every day. And it was really interesting because depending on what time of day that I left work or left home and had to travel the cities, depending if I had somebody with me so I could travel in the commuter lane, or depending what exit I needed to get off to get something for dinner that night, I would change my path. So that is exactly what a logic model does too. While a logic model is a roadmap, it's a roadmap that at various points you may need to stop and redirect. So think GPS or think a traffic jam. So while your logic model is a roadmap, it also is important for us to know that it's a date, not a marriage. It is not something that is going to be written down and is going to be that way forever. It's meant to be changed. It's meant to be adapted. Think GPS. So it's really important to understand that as we go into it. The conditions in the community are ever changing. So we want to get closer to our destination, not getting stuck in traffic. So as we implement our logic model, we're going to have to also think about, are we on the right path, or do we need to make some changes as we go along? And again, we're still rooted in that theory of change, but we understand that the conditions in our program or in our community may require us to use our GPS and make some changes as we go forward. So logic models have to have logic, hence the reason why they're called logic models. So the logic or rationale from your program can be developed from a number of sources. So if you do key informant assessments or focus groups, or if you've got a community needs assessment, behavioral theory. So if you're working on a program, you may know that there's theory of behavior. You may look at evidence-based practices, or the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has a directory of evidence-based programs, or NREP, the National Registry of Evidence proven programs that have a number of programs that, if implemented with fidelity, will impact certain issues or risk factors. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is based in data and is based in logic. So, for example, if we see that underage drinking is a problem in our community, we're not going to do a logic model that works on alcohol, on prescription drugs, because there's no logic to that. We need to be able to root the work that we're going to be doing in what's happening in the community. So if we're doing a mentoring program, I'll use that as an example later. If we're doing a mentoring program because we want to impact graduation rates, then we're assuming that we have data that shows that there's low graduation rates. We can't make a logic model with a program unless we have it really rooted in A, data to show that the problem exists, and B, information to show that what we're trying to do has a basis in research, evaluation, or evidence. So we have to have it rooted in a problem, and our solution has to be rooted in evidence. And those are two critically important things. We can't put a program that doesn't have an evidence base into a logic model and think we're going to get results or think we're going to get funded. We have to have it rooted in data and evidence and science. So there are a number of components of a logic model. And so I guess at this point, I'm just going to say a word about words. Depending on the logic model that you see, and even as we start to look at logic models in a little bit, you're going to see different language. You're going to see different terminology, and that's okay. I use this one as an example. At the end of the presentation, actually, I have a list of resources, and this one is one that I like. This came from the Center for Disease Control, and this shows the components of a logic model. And there's really two different sets of components to whatever logic model you're looking at. And so here's the breakdown of it. The first component of the logic model is what you're going to do. The second component of the logic model is how you're going to show outcomes. So this one is looking at those processes. So you're going to see things like inputs, outputs on your logic model. Some logic models may not have them. They may have strategies or interventions. Inputs are the resources. So what is it that you need to do to implement what it is that you're trying to implement? The activities are, what are those things that you're going to do? So what is it you're going to do? And then the outputs is, how do you measure the things that you did? Kind of think about process evaluation. So inputs are just resources. Activities are the things that you're going to do. And then the outputs are how you're going to count the activities that you did. So that's the implementation piece of the logic model. The second component of any logic model is the outcome piece. That's your evaluation, and we'll go into that as well. And you're going to have short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Now, the time frame for these really is going to be different depending on whether or not your logic model is based on a program or if it's based on a community level intervention. So, for example, if you're doing a program over the course of one school year, then your short-term outcomes may be the first semester, your intermediate outcomes may be by the second semester, and then your long-term outcomes could be by the end of the school year. But if you're looking at something that's at the community level, like say you're looking at underage drinking prevention, you're going to have different time frames for your outcomes. So best practice says when we're looking at community level outcomes, that your short-term outcomes are 6 to 24 months, your intermediate outcomes are about 1 to 3 years, and that your long-term outcomes are about 4 to 10 years. So keeping in mind that population level change takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to really see impact. So it really depends on what it is that you're looking at, whether you're looking at a program logic model or whether you're evaluating community intervention is going to impact what time frame those outcomes are. Now, again, I'm just sharing that information as we're giving the overview. As you get in.
Dorothy, you just cut out a little bit. Can you say that last sentence again?
A program or a community level intervention, those outcomes are going to be different. And as you start building your logic model and identifying your activities, the time frames are going to become clear as you start working through your logic model. Thank you, Amanda, and let me know if I cut it again because nothing has changed on my end. So I don't know what that was.
I don't know. It could just be a connection issue. You only gap out for just a couple seconds, and it hadn't happened for a while, but that time it did again. So I'll just keep you posted.
Okay, that sounds great.
Uh-huh.
So that's sort of the overview of what a logic model is and some of the components. We're going to start building a logic model. But before we start building a logic model, does anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Remembering that I can't see, I'm relying on Amanda.
Yep, I'll let you know if anything comes through, but nothing has right as of now.
Okay, awesome. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you'll notice that this worksheet here, and if I were going to be working at a logic model for the very first time, and I can actually, obviously this slide is going to be sent to Amanda, but I could turn it. This is sort of your scratch paper. So at this point, we're looking at the element of a logic model. So we're looking at this one would be a program. This is not a community level logic model. This is one for measuring a program. Here are the elements that I have identified. And again, a word about words, depending on the funder, depending on the logic model template that you're using, the words maybe, the terms may be a little different. These are sort of the basics. So for this one, the example here is that I'm looking at a mentoring program designed to reduce dropout rates. So the problem or the purpose of this program that we're going to be working on is to reduce high school dropout rates. The context is how will the mentoring program align with existing programs? Now, context is the environment in which the program or the initiative will exist. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So our problem or purpose is to reduce high school dropout rates. The context is how are we going to align it with other existing programs? What exists in our schools? What exists at the Boys and Girls Club? What other programs and services that are working toward youth exist? So that's the context. Inputs, we looked at that from the other slide. So what resources are we going to need to implement the program? Activities. So what is the mentoring program going to do? So we know what resources we need. So what are we going to do with those resources? The outputs are how are we going to measure what it is that we do with those activities? So what are the benchmarks to illustrate the activities? And the outcomes are what changes came about as the result of an initiative. Now, I just based this form on a number of different sources. if you're new to logic modeling and you're going to work on a logic model for a program that either you're already doing or one that you want to do, and you're new to logic modeling, I would use this sheet, I would take this slide, and I would answer each one of these questions before you even start to ever do your logic model. The idea behind this is, before we start filling in boxes, is that we exactly have a clear idea of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So we just answered all of these questions and I put them into some really basic boxes. Now, one of the things that you're going to see with logic models is they can be really, really complicated, or they can be really kind of basic. And these boxes are small. We may want to have supporting documentation for each one of these sort of buckets, for the inputs, for the activities, for the outputs, and for the outcomes. And this is a very basic model. I would say start basic and then move from here. And in fact, after we walk through this one, in a couple of slides, we're going to start looking at a real logic model for a mentoring program that has a lot more detail in it. But if we have this filled in first, we can get fancier from here. So note that all of the elements are here. One of the things that we don't see on here are assumptions, but we'll talk about that a little later on. And remember that we can add to the basic logic model. So this one is just based on that worksheet that we did. So our purpose is to implement a mentoring program to reduce high school dropout rates. Look at the very bottom. We see the context right here, or conditions it's sometimes called, is the program will take place in school buildings. So our purpose is to implement a mentoring program to reduce high school dropout rates. And our context or conditions are, it's going to take place in school buildings, or it's going to take place at the Boys and Girls Club, or it's going to take place at the YMCA, whatever that context is. So then we look at our boxes now, our categories. Well, those inputs, what are the things, those resources that we're going to need in order to implement that program? So in this one, I just put, well, we're going to need a paid coordinator. We're going to need AmeriCorps volunteers. Probably going to need an agreement with the school district to use the space. Probably going to need parent agreements and materials. Just a sample. Obviously, that's not an exhaustive list. So those are the resources that we need. So the activities now are, what are we going to do to implement the program? Well, we're going to need to train volunteers. We're going to need to recruit volunteers. We're going to need student recruitment, maybe student referrals from teachers. We're going to actually need to implement the tutoring program. So as you can see that there's a lot of activities that are going to be outlined that are going to illustrate how we're going to use the resources that were in the inputs. So then the outputs become very, very simple. For each one of the activities, you're going to have a corresponding output. So at this point, it's very, very easy. So the inputs are the resources, the activities are the pieces that you're going to do to implement the program, and the outputs are going to be how you're going to measure each one of those activities. So once you brainstorm all of your activities in that box, for each one of the activities, there's going to be a corresponding output. So with volunteer training, we can recruit the number of volunteers, we can, track the number of volunteers recruited, the number of volunteers trained. For the student recruitment and referrals, we'll have track the number of youth referred. We could also, in the program, record things like the number of active youth and the number of days that youth are attending. So for a tutoring program, we also may want to track the success rate. Whatever it is, whatever those benchmarks are embedded within that program. So then our outcomes are short-term, intermediate, and long-term. So in this one, what we'll see is in the short term, if we have well-trained volunteers, we've got active youth in the program, we're going to see that youth will probably report bonding with their mentor. So that would be the short term. The intermediate could be increased school performance. So because youth are now bonding with their mentor, they're active with their mentor, they're being tutored, whatever the activities are that's in the program, then we're going to see that youth are starting to have a increased school performance. They're probably not as truant. They're probably working a little bit harder, maybe having help with their homework, so they've got better performance at school. Well, if they've got better performance at school, then we're going to see in the long term reduction in the dropout rates. So this is a very basic program logic model. Now, I walked through it really slow because we're going to build from here. At this point, Amanda, I'm going to ask you to see if anyone has any questions on this basic logic model.
All right, Dorothy, I'll let you know if anything comes through. There is nothing there as of right now.
Okay, all right.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a really basic logic model. Again, you're going to see logic models that are a lot more complicated than this, but it's okay to start really simple. So just to recap one more time. So there's the elements. That's your scratch pad. Here's how you start laying it out into a logic model form. And then here, let's look at how we'd find data. So now I'm going to ask you to answer some of these. How would you define the problem? Remember, we have to have this rooted in data. So looking at dropout rates, remember, we have to establish that there's a problem. How would you measure or how would you illustrate the dropout rates in your community? How would you measure that? Amanda, has anybody responded?
Yes, Shannon just did, and she said with school data.
Sure. School data is one way to do it.
Yeah, and someone else said ask the school as well.
Sure. Yeah. So you're going to be able to find out from the school what the dropout rates are. Your Department of Public Instruction or Department of Education keeps that data. Your school district's going to have that. So that's going to give you some quantitative data. You may also want to do some focus groups. So you want to define the problem. You're going to want to know what the rates of dropouts are, but you're also going to need to know what would make kids stay in school. So we can't just jump into doing a mentoring program because there's dropout rates if youth aren't going to go to the program. So school data will start giving us the rates of dropouts. How else might we be able to define the problem so that we can develop a theory of change that says we know that by doing a mentoring program, we're going to be able to increase graduation rates? How do you think we could do that? Amanda, were there any responses?
There was not. I'm still waiting for someone to
that's
answer.
Okay. That's okay. So when we're looking at defining a problem, dropout rates are important, but again, we want to be able to have a theory of change that says, well, we know that youth are dropping out because, so the dropout rates are going to give us the data. They're going to give us the facts, the trends, but they're not going to give us sort of that depth of meaning. So you may want to do focus groups with youth. You may want to interview parents. You may want to interview school counselors. You may want to have that qualitative piece that says, well, you know what, kids are just really not, they don't have, they're not bonded with adults. They're not getting help with their homework. They just need positive role models in their community. See, the dropout rates aren't going to give us that level of detail. So when you define the problem, we're going to be measuring dropout rates, but we want to also have that qualitative piece. So that's really important to understand that we have the data to paint a full picture. Now, to track your activities is your process measures, and that one's really easy. We already talked about that on the last slide. Those are our outputs, the numbers of volunteers trained and recruited, the number of youth active and referred, and the number of days that the youth attend. So that's all your process measures. Then when we're looking at our outcome measures, this is where that data that I just talked about is really going to be important. So the data that we use to define the problem is also going to be the data that we use to define our outcomes. Let me repeat that. The data that we use to define the problem is also going to be the data that we use to measure our outcomes. So for example, if we looked at reduced dropout rates there in the long term, you guys talked about that, we're going to get that data from the school. But how are we going to get the youth report bonding with a mentor? Well, that's probably going to be qualitative. We're probably going to do uh, focus groups with youth who say that they don't have positive role models in the community or that they don't have positive bonding. But after the intervention, we're going to interview the kids that are in the program, and they're going to say, yeah, you know what? I feel like I've bonded with my mentor. And then we're going to also then monitor those youth that are in the program to see if their grades are improving. So see, we've got 3 different measures right there that are going to track our outcomes. But it's really important that we have that picture, we have that baseline when we're defining the problem. Questions on that?
There are not any at this time.
Okay. All right. This is really important because we want to make sure that we're setting our logic model up in a way that we're going to be actually not just outlining what it is that we're going to do, but what it is that we have done. And so this data doesn't have to be complex, but it has to measure exactly what it is that we're doing. So, what does this have to do with logic models? Any thoughts? Well,
Someone just said cause and effect.
absolutely. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And if anybody has ever played, and there's a number of ways to play dominoes, but if you've ever lined them up and you've hit one, they hit all of the rest of them all the way down. It's cause and effect. That's exactly what a logic model does, is it shows that cause and effect. Remember, going back to our theory of change, that we know based on the fact that we've defined the problem, we have researched evidence-based effective solutions, and we've laid it out so that now if we do this intervention, we know that logically we're going to have these outputs or these outcomes. So let's take a look at it when we're looking at our really basic logic model here. So you'll see that I put a big green arrow over onto outcomes. So when we're looking at our dominoes, we're going to look at the short, intermediate, and long term. And I'm going to talk about the domino effect and the logic in a couple of examples as we go forward. So in the short term, looking at this example, we're going to have students working with volunteers in the mentoring program. So in the short term, we're going to really work on developing relationships between the volunteers and the youth. And then we're going to do, at the end of the first semester, we're going to do a survey of the youth saying, do you feel like you have bonded with your mentor? Do you feel like, they're listening to you and they are supporting you? So in the short term, if that happens, if they report, yes, we know that our activities are working. So what would happen if in the short term we interviewed youth and we said, how's it going with your mentor? Are you feeling valued? Are you feeling supported? And all of the youth reported no. What would we do then? Any thoughts?
We're just waiting on to see if anything comes through here.
Thoughts? So in this one, this is that GPS. And I know that's an extreme example, but that short term, if we uncover in the short term that our program isn't working, that youth aren't attending it because they're just not feeling like it's a good use of their time, or they're not bonding with the volunteers, that in the short term is our clarion call to say, okay, we need to go back and look at what our activities are and see, are we training the volunteers properly? Are we recruiting the right people? Are we supervising the volunteers properly? Are we offering at the right location? Are we offering at the right time? Looking at what it is that we can do in the short term so that we can impact that short-term benchmark. So that's really important. But if we do have successful youth reporting bonding with their mentors in the short term, and they're feeling valued and they're getting their homework done and there's less stress at home at night because there's no fighting over homework, do you think that in the intermediate we'll see increased school performance? Well, and if we see increased school performance, we're going to see also other indicators increase. We're going to see that youth are feeling more confident. They're feeling more connected to their community and to their school potentially. And so in the long run, we should see reduction in dropout rates. That's the domino effect. If youth report bonding with their mentors successfully, then hopefully they're going to see an increase in school performance. If they're going to see an increase in school performance, then we should see a reduction in dropout rates. That's the domino effect. And that's the logic of your logic model. So after you map it out, it's really important that you not only go from short to long, but also go from long to short. So to receive reduction in dropout rates, do we need to see increased school performance? And in order to see increased school performance, do we need youth having an adult supporting them along the way? So we need to see either way that the logic works in a logic model. Any questions on the logic of the logic model before we start looking at different formats? You guys are quiet today.
Yeah, no questions have come through yet, but I'll interrupt you if you had.
Okay.
Somebody did answer, Alice did answer the question. It just came up right after you started. And she just said, compare baseline first and then ask questions for volunteers to better discuss answers.
Perfect. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's it. That's your process piece. So it's really important that as you look at your logic model, you understand that this isn't just a one and done plan, but that you have to use those outputs and those short-term indicators to determine whether or not you're actually on track and on target. So let's take a look at logic models. Again, there's so many different formats. And I have to tell you, I still sometimes look at some logic models and I just want to look away because I feel like I don't know where to look first. I don't know where to start. And so starting at the basics is really important. So the other thing to keep in mind, if the logic model is a roadmap, then the evaluation is your destination. The evaluation is your destination. And the beautiful thing about a logic model is it not only tells you what you're going to do, but it also articulates what you did. Now, this is really important for your funders because they're going to want to see that their investment in you actually achieved outcomes. This is going to be really important for your volunteers because your volunteers want to be part of something that's successful. It's going to be really difficult to recruit mentors to a program that is not showing outcomes, right? But if you can show, look, here's the successes of our program, then you're going to have more people wanting to get on board. So let's take a look now at a program logic model. Remember I said there's two different types of logic models that we're going to touch on today. One is a program logic model, and the other one is a community level logic model, sort of the public health realm. This one is a real logic model, and this is on a youth leadership program. So it's really, this is again is a real example of something that's kind of based on my very simplistic example of a mentoring program. But let's walk through this logic model. Because this logic model, this template, could really be, I'm going to go right back to this one for a second. This basic logic model could actually be turned into this more complex logic model by starting first with your planning sheet, then moving into really simplistic boxes, and then looking at a more complex template and filling in the details from there. So doing it in phases. But looking at all of the components of the logic model that I already talked about today, they're all here. And again, I also mentioned you can also make some additions, and here there's a few more additions. So first of all, at the very beginning, you're going to see the situation. That's really the problem or the program. So this is saying that older youth lack opportunities to learn and practice leadership skills that build strong citizens of the future. Research shows the importance of educating adults and building their community to help create opportunities for youth to develop their leadership skills. So, two really important things there. The situation that they're describing, they're going to have data to measure it. So they're going to have to be able to illustrate that. But they've established the problem. Look at this. Research shows the importance of educating adults and building their community to help create opportunities for youth to develop their leadership skills. That's your evidence base. So right there, they've articulated in two simple lines the problem and the fact that what is going to be outlined on this logic model has a deep root in research. So now let's look at the logic model. Inputs, we know what the inputs are. Those are the resources. So we're going to need staff time, support time, funding. We're going to need a curriculum, travel, publications, volunteers. And then over here is your activities. So your activities are all of those things that are listed in the education activities for older youth. They've added, and you'll see here, the activities and the outputs. So the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes are along the top. It's easy to get confused by looking at different logic models, but remembering that we started out with this really basic one, we know what those key terms are. So we're going to put our activities in that box. This one added who. So they talk about the exact people that are going to be doing those different initiatives. Again, they're just adding. And then look at that. They've got their short, their medium term, and their long-term outcomes. And they're calling their outcomes the impact. So this is just a more detailed example of the very, very basic components of a logic model. Again, this may be dictated by funders. This may be dictated by your key stakeholders. But if you start with a basic logic model, you can then adapt or develop or add any details to make it suit different audiences. One of the things that I always do last as well is those arrows, because sometimes those arrows can be a little bit make sense in terms of flowing from the activities over to the impact. The other pieces that I want to just call your attention to are at the bottom. Again, these are add-ons or additions to the basic logic model. One is your assumptions. So your assumptions are, in this one, that older 4-H youth desire to be included in decision-making processes and have their voices heard. And after an education, will agree upon the importance of inclusion.
Oh, Dorothy, you just cut out again. If you just repeat your last sentence.
Sure. I don't know what's happening. So your assumptions are going to be based in your theory of change or the conditions that are in your community. The other piece that's in their green box is the external factors. That's that we talked about in the context. So the context here is that there's competition for older youth time, and that the youth may have pre-existing ideas and feelings about, or excuse me, adults may have pre-existing ideas and feelings about the value of youth ideas. So those are going to be those could be the factors that could impact positively or negatively your work. So things that could be external factors are, gosh, that we talked about when we were together. External factors are limitations on transportation to the program, or stigma related to attending an after-school program. I'm just brainstorming here. But those are the external factors that you want to name and frame. Now, keeping in mind, this is all building on that very basic logic model that started as that brainstorm sheet and moved into those basic boxes. And then based on whatever template, you can make those additions. Sort of the Cadillac version of a program logic model that's very, very similar to the one that we worked on in the basic example. So any comments or questions on this one?
Nothing has come through yet, so if anything does, I will interrupt you.
Okay. So let me ask folks at this point, does this logic model make sense, or does it feel overwhelming? Are there too many boxes and arrows? What are your thoughts on this logic model?
It says it makes sense, but it's a little overwhelming. And Shannon says, I like it. I've done a more complicated one before.
Good. Well, Shannon, that's good. So I one of the things that I do is make things as easy as possible. But the reason I wanted to start with this, and Shannon, I've done more complicated ones too. This is sort of logic models 101. Go back to this very basic one. And once you get this down and you know exactly what you want with this, then you can start getting more complicated from there. That's my point of that. And Shannon, yes, this is not a complicated logic model. On funders, you may have a number. This one is a community level logic model. Now, this is the kind of logic model that you're either going to love or you're not going to love, based on whether or not you're comfortable with logic models. I just wanted to show this one because this one has a lot going on. But if you look at it, what is important here, you still see the same basic elements that we had in the very simplistic basic logic model, right? So let's go from left to right on this one. We still see our inputs. We still see our outputs. So our outputs are how you track your activities. Instead of having who now, they have participation. So who will be, which really is who as well. You're also looking at your outcomes. They have, in this interest, this is an interesting one because they have arranged the outputs based on individuals, on communities and institutions, and on the community, on structures, policies, and practices, so sort of environment. And so they have identified their outputs, who's being involved, and also the outcomes according to those three criteria. Now, to make a more complicated logic model like this, I would still start with a basic logic model. I would have a basic logic model for each one of those three sectors: individuals, communities and institutions, and social structures, and then synthesize it all onto that logic model. Note too, they also have those assumptions and those external factors. So the assumptions are those pieces that show the rationale why you think this is going to work. The external factors are really important when we get to evaluation. And we'll talk about those external factors in just a minute when we talk about evaluation. But this is an example of a community level logic model.
Dorothy, we had a couple other comments come in about the simple one, and someone said or Tessa said, I like the look of the basic one, but they understand why we need a more in-depth one. And Karen mentioned that she likes the simplicity. One model she has for another funder is over 12 pages long.
Yeah, I've seen those logic models. And remember, and we'll talk about that when we sort of wrap up, is that there's so many different requirements. And in fact, I'm working with United Ways here in a certain group of United Ways here in Wisconsin, actually, and we're working on revising the way that they have their folks that they fund report, because the logic models were not really meaningful to the agency or to the organization that was doing the work. They were really, really complex. And so what they realized was that the agency was spending so much time trying to fill in the boxes that they weren't really necessarily understanding what it is that we're trying to do in that particular agency. So funders may dictate, they may have a required way of doing it, but again, I always start basic and add from there. I always want to make sure that I understand the logic. And when I start looking at complicated logic models like this one, and this one isn't really complicated either, it's just that it's got 3 different layers on it. But if I don't have a basic understanding of the terms, then I get lost as I'm trying to fill in the boxes. So that's why I would say do it in phases. Start with that scratch sheet. Make sure you've got your data as part of that scratch sheet. Put it in the basic logic model, and then find a template that's going to fit either for your funder or also for your audience, because a model that's 12 pages long may be exactly what the funder wants and is going to tell them exactly what they want. But when you're trying to recruit volunteers, are you going to show them a 12-page logic model? No. You're probably going to show them that basic logic model that illustrates exactly what it is that the activities are and what the outcomes are. So I'm going to go back to this one. For those of you who attended SAPST, and this is looking at those community level logic models. And I have differentiated between program logic models and community level logic models for a number of reasons. The time frame is one, the interventions are one, and also the way you evaluate is really very, very different between a program and a community level initiative. But in this one, I really still like this one if you're working on a community level intervention because it's rooted in data. So I'm just going to walk through this again because this really is a good roadmap. So you look at your problems and related behaviors. That's your data. You look at the risk and protective factors. Again, the data, what's happening in the community, and then those interventions. So if the problem is alcohol, underage drinking, and the risk factor is that kids are able to buy it in bars, then your intervention is going to be to address factors to make sure that you do alcohol. Kids can't get alcohol anymore. Again, a word about.
Oh, Dorothy, you just cut out again. So if you just start over right at the new, just your last sentence there. Yep.
So again, it's a word about words, and it really depends on the funder or the organization, how they're going to use the term. Please don't get caught up in terms, but understand that there's a number of different ways of explaining the same thing. Again, we walked through this when we were together doing the sustainability training, and we just touched on logic models, but I just want to, this is still a really good basic example. So the problem here is high blood pressure. The risk factors is that there's high rates of overweight in your community, so the interventions could be exercise or reduce size of food portions, and so in the short term, you're going to start to see people lose weight, and then in the long term, you're going to see that the low blood pressure, that you're going to see lower blood pressure. So that's going to be your long-term outcome. Now, this is a really basic logic model. It's a community level logic model. And remember, we talked about context or external factors or assumptions. None of those are on here. So if we did this in a community where it's a food desert, so there's no access to, there's no gym, people can't afford exercise equipment, shoes, then those external factors are going to impact our outcomes. So it's really important for us to understand and to map onto our logic model those external factors that we're looking for, or they could actually impact us in a negative way. But it's really important as you're developing your logic model to make sure that you have those context or those external factors or assumptions. Doesn't matter what the term is, but just document those pieces on your logic model so that you show the funder, the key stakeholders, that you're aware of all of the different issues that are existing in the community. Again, this one is a great way to show how you get those outcomes, short and long-term outcomes. So in this one, we see that the long-term outcomes are related to the problems. The risk and protective factors are the short-term outcomes, and then your interventions are really those outputs. Those are the activities that you're going to be doing. So those are those things that you're going to measure the number of outputs. Again, looking at a process evaluation was the intervention intended as completed as attended? So those are your activities, that's your process, that's your GPS, and your outcome is did anything change? And that's your short and long-term outcomes. So again, that process evaluation is really, really important, and you need to have that outlined on your logic model so you're measuring back to your logic model regularly, because you don't want to get to the point where you're at your 3-year term and you don't get your outcomes because you didn't make adjustments to the interventions so that they were fitting, they were firing on all cylinders. So if you're doing responsible beverage server training and nobody's coming because you're offering it in the morning and bartenders are up till 3 o'clock in the morning and you're at the end of the long term and you haven't seen a decrease in youth accessing alcohol from retailers, well, you know what? We probably should have changed way back when. We probably should have changed when or where we held those trainings. So that's that process evaluation piece.
Dorothy, someone just commented, it was Alice, and she said, so one might also end up addressing the external factors as well to improve overall outcome. More complicated logic model.
Yes, yes and no. When we talk about contribution versus attribution, we'll talk about that. It really depends on whether or not you have the resources to actually address those external factors, or if you just need to name them. Because sometimes those external factors, for example, if you're looking at a community level logic model, and you're looking at parents who provide alcohol, so you're trying to reduce alcohol access to youth, which will impact your long-term goal, and that would be to reduce underage drinking. Your risk factor would be to reduce that it's legal to provide. I don't have the ability to impact that external factor. I just need to name that external factor. So that would be an example of an external factor that we probably wouldn't have the resources or the capacity to impact. On the program level, if you're working on an after-school program, for example, and one of the external factors is transportation is an issue, you may or may not have the resources actually to impact the transportation, but by putting it on the logic model as an external factor, you may be able to partner with another organization and say, look, here's our logic model, here's our theory of change, and here's an external factor that is negatively impacting the work that we're trying to do. Will you get on board and help us by providing this transportation? Because as you can see, if you provide the transportation, we're going to get these positive outcomes. So you can name those external factors, and either you may have resources, you may be able to find resources, or at a minimum, you'll be able to external factors when you're looking at your evaluation. Really good question. So there are many, many uses for a logic model. Again, it's to illustrate your program purpose. It's to identify what it is that you're trying to do. And, remember a month ago when we were talking about sustainability. Sustainability is great when it comes to grant writing and funding, but beyond that, remember we talked about we want to be an organization that the community just can't live without. Well, a logic model is going to be able to illustrate that we made those changes. And I walked through a number of different types of logic models. I didn't get too complicated, no 12-page logic models. But you know what? You don't necessarily need a 12-page logic model. You need to just be able to articulate in a snapshot who you are, what you're doing, and what the outcomes are. You're going to also be able to assess whether the proposed program makes sense. And again, that's that line logic, the dominoes. Does it make sense? If we do this, will this happen? It also helps you set priorities funding and for other resources and for uses of your time. And it also tells you what you expect in the short, the intermediate, and the long term. I really think if you're working with a board or volunteers that don't know logic models, or that there's I would planning sheet and a really basic logic model, just so people know exactly what it is that they're working at, and what the outcomes are. So this is the GPS piece. During the implementation, it's important for you to be able to see when you're looking, do we have the inputs that we need? How are we going to manage those inputs that we need? So if we need more resources, if we need more volunteers, it's going to be able to outline exactly what we need. It's going to also be able to tell us if we need to make adaptations. I shared a couple of examples, just brainstorming. But so if you're doing a volunteer training and you're not getting your volunteers to show up, why? That's that sort of just in time. Is this activity working? If you had a number of youth that just stopped coming to the program, if law enforcement won't work with you anymore to do alcohol age compliance checks, whatever it is that's happening, you need to stop right there and make adaptations based on what you've outlined in your logic model. And the other piece is too, and this is really, really important, is remember that our program, we're not the only one working in the community to address that problem, most likely. So a logic model is going to be able to show what it is that we're doing to reduce duplication of efforts. So for example, if you're working on a mentoring program and another organization is looking for funding from the United Way or a local community foundation, you're going to be able to illustrate, well, this is the program that we're already working on. Why don't we shore up support for this particular program instead of starting another one. So it helps reduce duplication of efforts. But if you can't articulate that, you're not necessarily going to be able to maintain your resources. So evaluation is the most important piece of the logic model because everyone wants to know if we've made a difference. A good logic model is going to help you document your outcomes. It's also going to be able to organize whether or not you're effective. Now, this piece, contribution versus attribution, is critically, critically important. So when we're talking about contribution versus attribution, what we're really talking about is program versus community level change. So let's take about attribution. So and we are working with seventh graders. We're doing a program with seventh graders. And so in school A, we're doing a program with seventh graders. And in school B, we're not doing any program at all. So our control group is school A. So we control the classroom environment, we control the content that's delivered to them, and then we are going to evaluate whether or not they've got changes in knowledge as a result of being in that program. If school A and the seventh graders reports a change in knowledge, and school B that didn't have the program doesn't have any change in knowledge, then we're going to be able to say that our program actually created this change. We're going to be able to take full credit for it. That's attribution. So we can't do that when we're looking at community level change. We also can't do that when we're working in the context of schools or other environments. So for example, if we're doing a underage drinking prevention initiative and we see that law enforcement loses all their funding and they don't have controls, for example, then we're not going to see the outcomes because we're operating in the context of a community and there's factors that we can't control. And that's critically important. So if we're working on underage drinking prevention, for example, and we see that a major employer shuts down, and so we see higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse within the community, we can't control that. Be able to illustrate that we made an impact based on the work that we did. So the contribution piece is important to understand that our work is in the context of a whole lot of other factors that happen in a community, but a logic model is going to be able to say, but here's what we did. Here's what we did to contribute to the solution. Now, sometimes those factors in the community will help move our program along, and sometimes they're going to be opposing the work that we're doing. But it's really important for us to be able to say we contributed to this solution by doing this. So contribution versus attribution is a really, really important evaluation term that is articulated really well by your logic model. The other piece for evaluation is it really helps to prepare reports for media, for funders, for other stakeholders, volunteers, and most importantly, it allows you to tell the story of your organization. It allows you to show how you reach your mission and vision and what the outcomes were. So at this point, I am going to ask if there's any questions or thoughts or comments on what we've covered in logic models.
All right, I will let you know as they come in.
All right. So, yeah, stop me if there's any questions. So right now, I just want to show you. So what I showed you today was really basic. If you feel like doing a more complicated logic model, again, this is not an endorsement. This is a program that I found while working on a project with public health here over the last couple of years. And we actually found this program. It's available free, but you can also have a paid version as well. I think the free version might just be a trial. But I just wanted to show you because there's a whole lot out there, a whole lot of different programs out there for logic modeling. Again, I would start with a really basic logic model with that scratch sheet so you understand exactly what it is you're trying to do, your theory of change and your data. But then you can get really fancy. this is just an example of a logic model that I did as part of this project. This was a strategy map. We call it a strategy map. It's a logic model for preventing and reducing alcohol misuse. And we did it last year as part of the Community Health and Action. So this is actually a program called DoView, and it allows you to build your logic model. And it's not a live link, but what I really love about this is, as you can see, it's a little different, but see, I have my inputs. Those are my resources here. Now, this is a community level logic model. And then we also have our activities, which are the green. And then our blue is our impact or outcomes. What I really like about this particular program is, and again, it's not live, but you can see the little boxes in the corners here. These boxes allow you to open up new fields. So for example, when I was doing this logic model, if I put my input of coalition building and maintenance, when you click on that, you can put all your detail right in there. So when you're building your basic logic model, remember I said for each one of those boxes, you're gonna have to have supporting document. What I love about this DoView is it allows you to electronically embed all of that supporting documentation for each one of those boxes right in the program. So it's not the most user-friendly program. Again, it's not an endorsement. I just wanted to share with you that there's a lot of information and resources out there related to logic modeling once you have the basics down. And this logic model, I think when we printed it off, now this is a big, broad logic model that's designed for communities to use, but I think when we printed it, 76 pages. But we started out with the same basic elements. Still, the very front page is the basics, and then it gets more complicated from there.
Dorothy, a question came through. It says, what program does this strategy map use?
It's called, right here, doview.com.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
And again, endorsement, I'm just sharing because I used it.
Okay, I think you have just cut out again.
I don't know what's.
Say something again.
Can everyone hear me now?
I can, yes. And
Internet problems today.
I know. And that is the only question right now. Are you still? Oh, go ahead.
I'm still here. And then my last slide.
Oh, you cut out again. You just said, this is my last slide, and then we didn't hear anything.
My goodness. Okay.
It's okay. Oh, try one more time. I don't know what's going on, if it's my end with our email or with our server or something, but I can't hear you. Does anyone else have any questions while we are waiting for Dorothy to get back? Oh, here's another one. Yep, they can't hear either. Are there any other questions? And I will be distributing the slideshow as well, along with the recording once it's completed. Dorothy, I don't know what happened, but we do not hear you anymore. I can see that you're still online.
Yeah,
Oh, there you are. Yeah, now I can hear you.
I don't know what.
All right. You have one other question, and it's from Jill, and she said, I'm still a little confused on how a logic model and a strategic plan work together. But we've lost Dorothy again. Dorothy, again, that question, if maybe now if you minimize your screen, you can get in the chat box. But the question is how a logic model and strategic plan work together. She said she's still here. Oh, it says your network bandwidth is low, Dorothy. That's the only thing I've gotten. And we'll just wait for Dorothy. She said the strategic plan is comprised of mission vision, objectives and strategies, all of which are rooted in the logic model. So it seems that she's like, when I am working with communities, we start with mission and vision, then develop the logic model. Does that provide some clarity for you, Jill? Then after the logic model is developed, they base the strategic priorities around how to accomplish the outcomes identified in the logic model. Yes. I don't know, Jill, you don't sound too sure. So think of the logic model as a skeleton. Dorothy, you can try and talk again and see if that works. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, and the strategic plan is the meat on the bones of the skeleton. So your logic model is the skeleton, and then your strategic plan is the meat on the bones.
Dorothy Cheney.
Yep, we can hear you.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
Oh, all right. So does anyone else have any other questions? You can either email me or email Dorothy or email me to get Dorothy's email address, and we can compile all those answers and questions and get those out to you, and we get the recording and PowerPoint out to you as well. And don't forget, our next session, Understanding and Identifying Resources, will be on Thursday, June 15th at 10 a.m. But thank you all for listening. And again, we'll get the recording and the slides out to you soon. And if there are additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Dorothy or myself. And I'm Amanda McCurley. So, all right. Well, thank you.